In this video, we'll go over some of the most important events of the 20th century. So this is just for the United States, the 20th century. When World War I erupted in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson pledged neutrality for the United States, a position favored by the vast majority of Americans. The U.S. was able to stay neutral until 1917. Germany had decided to resume unrestricted submarine warfare against any vessel approaching British waters. This attempt to starve Britain into surrender was balanced against the knowledge that it would almost certainly bring the United States into the war. German U-boats started sinking American merchant ships in the North Atlantic soon after. Wilson then asked Congress for a war to end all wars that would, quote unquote, make the world safe for democracy, and Congress voted to declare war on Germany on April 6, 1917. World War II was a global war that lasted from 1939 to 1945, although related conflicts began earlier. It involved the vast majority of the world's countries, including all of the great powers, eventually forming two opposing military alliances, the Allies and the Axis. This you need to know. The Allies were the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The Axis was Japan, Italy, and Germany. Basic battle between fascism and democracy. The war ended the Great Depression for the United States. The U.S. involvement in the war began with the attack on Pearl Harbor. The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits the states and the federal government from denying the right to vote to citizens of the United States on the basis of sex. It was ratified on August 18, 1920. Here we go, Watergate. Watergate was a major political scandal that occurred in the United States in the 1970s following a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. in 1972, and President Richard Nixon's administration attempted cover-up of its involvement. When the conspiracy was discovered and investigated by the U.S. Congress, the Nixon administration's resistance to its probes led to a constitutional crisis. The scandal led to the discovery of multiple abuses of power by the Nixon administration, an impeachment process against the president, and the resignation of Nixon. The scandal also resulted in the indictment of 69 people, with trials or pleas resulting in 48 being found guilty, many of whom were Nixon's top administration officials. There will usually be an entrepreneur question. Henry Ford was an American industrialist, the founder of the Ford Motor Company, and the sponsor of the development of the assembly line technique of mass production. Although Ford invented neither the automobile nor the assembly line, he developed and manufactured the first automobile that many middle-class Americans could afford. John Rockefeller was an American oil industry business magnate and philanthropist. He's widely considered the wealthiest American of all time and the richest person in modern history. Andrew Carnegie was a Scottish-American industrialist who led the expansion of the American steel industry in the late 19th century and is often identified as one of the richest people and Americans ever. Now, in truth, Ford is much more 20th century than Rockefeller or Carnegie, and maybe because of that, the question is usually about Henry Ford. So with what we just said about entrepreneurs, understanding that Ford really helped to develop the automobile and the assembly line would be a key point to remember. The Patriot Act can show up. The USA Patriot Act is an act of Congress that was signed into law by then President George W. Bush on October 26, 2001. With its 10-letter abbreviation, USA Patriot, expanded, The full title is Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act of 2001. It's a big one. The Vietnam War. Really the key point here is that the Vietnam War, the reason that the United States entered it was to prevent communist takeover of South Vietnam. And finally, we have Brown versus the Board of Education. This case questioned the constitutionality of segregation in schools, and separate but equal was determined to be unconstitutional.